Chapter 80. Be Diligent. It was dusk by the time the Buddha and the bhikkhus reached the forest of sal trees. The Buddha asked Ananda to prepare a place between two sal trees for him to lie down. The Buddha lay on his side, his head facing the north. All the bhikkhus sat around him. They knew that the Buddha would pass into nirvana that same night. The Buddha looked up at the trees and said, "Ananda, look, it is not yet spring, but the sal trees are covered with red blossoms. Do you see the petals falling on the Tathagata's robes and on the robes of all the bhikkhus? This forest is truly beautiful. Do you see the western horizon all aglow from the setting sun? Do you hear the gentle breeze rustling in the sal branches? The Tathagata finds all these things lovely and touching. Bhikkhus, if you want to please me, if you want to express your respect and gratitude to the Tathagata, there is only one way, and that is by living the teaching." The evening was warm, and Venerable Upavanna stood over the Buddha to fan him, but the Buddha asked him not to. Perhaps the Buddha did not want his splendid view of the setting sun obstructed. The Buddha asked Venerable Anuruddha, "I do not see Ananda. Where is he?" Another bhikkhu spoke up. "I saw Brother Ananda stand behind some trees weeping. He was saying to himself, 'I have not yet attained my spiritual goal, and now my teacher is dying. Who has ever cared more deeply for me than my teacher?'" The Buddha asked the bhikkhu to summon Ananda. The Buddha tried to comfort Ananda. He said, "Don't be so sad, Ananda. The Tathagata has often reminded you that all dharmas are impermanent. With birth there is death, with arising there is dissolving, with coming together there is separation. How can there be birth without death? How can there be arising without dissolving? How can they be coming together without separation? Ananda, you have cared for me with all your heart for many years. You've devoted all your efforts to helping me, and I am most grateful to you. Your merit is great, Ananda, but you can go even further. If you make just a little more effort, you can overcome birth and death. You can attain freedom and transcend every sorrow. I know you can do that, and that is what would make me most happy." Turning to the other bhikkhus, the Buddha said, "No one has been as good an attendant as Ananda. Other attendants in the past sometimes dropped my robe or bowl to the ground, but never Ananda. He has taken care of all my needs from the tiniest detail to the largest tasks. Ananda always knew when and where a bhikkhu, bhikkhuni, lay disciple, king, official or practitioner from a different religious sect should meet with me. He arranged all meetings most effectively and intelligently. The Tathagata believes that no enlightened master in the past or future could have an attendant more talented and devoted than Ananda." Venerable Ananda wiped his tears and said, "Lord, please don't pass away here. Kushanara is just a small town of mud dwellings. There are so many more worthy places, like Sampa, Rajgaha, Savatthi, Sakata, Kosambi or Varanasi. Please, Lord, select such a place to pass away, so that more people will have a chance to see your face one last time." The Buddha replied, "Ananda, Kusinara is also important, even if it is no more than a small town of mud dwellings. The Tathagata finds this forest most agreeable, Ananda, do you see the sal flowers falling about me? The Buddha asked Ananda to go into Kusinara and announced to the Mallas that the Buddha would pass into nirvana in the grove of sal trees at the night's last watch. When the Malla people heard this news, they hastily made their way to the forest. An ascetic named Subhada was among them. While the people took turns in bowing to the Buddha, Subhada asked Venerable Ananda if he could have an audience with the Buddha. Ananda refused, saying the Buddha was too tired to receive anyone. But the Buddha overheard their conversation and said, Ananda, let ascetic Subhada speak with me. The Tathagata will receive him. Ascetic Subhada knelt before the Buddha. He'd long felt drawn to the Buddha's teaching, but had never met him before. He bowed and said, Lord, I have heard about spiritual leaders such as Purana Kassapa, Akali Gosala, Ajita Kesakambalin, Buddhaka Kakyana, Sanjaya Balathaputta, and Nigantha Nathaputta. I would like to ask if, according to you, any of them attained true enlightenment. The Buddha answered, Subhada, whether or not they attained enlightenment is not a necessary thing to discuss now. Subhada, the Tathagata will show you the path by which you yourself can attain enlightenment. The Buddha spoke to Subhada about the Noble Eightfold Path. He concluded by saying, Subhada, wherever the Noble Eightfold Path is truly practiced, you will find people who have attained enlightenment. Subhada, if you follow this path, you too can attain enlightenment. Ascetic Subhada felt his heart suddenly opened. He was filled with great happiness. He asked the Buddha to accept him as a bhikkhu. The Buddha asked the Venerable Anuruddha to perform the ordination ceremony right then and there. Subhada was the last disciple received by the Buddha. After Subhada's head was shaved, he received the precepts and was given a robe and bowl. The Buddha then looked at all the bhikkhus sitting around him. Many bhikkhus from the vicinity had arrived, and so there were now nearly 500. The Buddha spoke to them. Bhikkhus, if you have any doubts or perplexity concerning the teaching, now is the time to ask the Tathagata about it. Do not let this opportunity pass by, so that you will later reproach yourself, saying, that day I was face to face with the Buddha, but I did not ask him. The Buddha repeated these words 3 times, but no bhikkhu spoke. Venerable Ananda exclaimed, Lord, it is truly wonderful. I have faith in the community of bhikkhus. I have faith in the Sangha. Everyone has clearly understood your teaching. No one has any doubts or perplexity about your teaching and the path to realize it. The Buddha said, Ananda, you speak from faith, while the Tathagata has direct knowledge. The Tathagata knows that all the bhikkhus here possess deep faith in the 3 gems. Even the lowest attainment amongst these bhikkhus is that of stream enterer. The Buddha looked quietly over the community and then said, Bhikkhus, listen to what the Tathagata now says. Dharmas are impermanent. If there is birth, there is death. Be diligent in your efforts to attain liberation. The Buddha closed his eyes. He had spoken his last words. The earth shook. Sal blossoms fell like rain. Everyone felt their minds and their bodies tremble. They knew the Buddha had passed into nirvana. Let's just pause and come back to our breathing before we go on with the reading. The Buddha had passed away. Some bhikkhus threw up their arms and flung themselves on the ground. They wailed, "The Buddha has passed away, the Lord has died. The eyes of the world are no more. Who can we take refuge in now?" While these bhikkhus cried and thrashed about, other bhikkhus sat silently, observing their breath and contemplating the things that the Buddha had taught them. Venerable Anuruddha spoke up. "Brothers, do not cry so pitifully. The Lord Buddha taught us that with birth there is death, with arising there is dissolving, with coming together there is separation. If you understand and follow the Buddha's teaching, you will cease to make such a disturbance. Please sit up again and follow your breathing. We will maintain silence." Everyone returned to his place and followed Venerable Anuruddha's counsel. He led them in reciting sutras they all knew by heart, which spoke about impermanence, emptiness of self, non-attachment and liberation. Calm dignity was restored. The malas lit torches. Sounds of chanting echoed impressively in the dark night, as everyone placed his full awareness on the words in the sutras. After a lengthy recitation, Venerable Anuruddha gave a Dharma talk. He praised the Buddha's attainments, his wisdom, compassion, virtue, concentration, joy and equanimity. When the Venerable Anuruddha finished speaking, Venerable Ananda recounted beautiful episodes from the Buddha's life. Throughout the night, the two Venerables took turns speaking. The 500 bhikkhus and 300 lay disciples listened quietly. As torches burned down, new ones were lit to take their place until dawn broke. Chapter 81. Old Path, White Clouds. When day broke, Venerable Anuruddha said to Venerable Ananda, "Brother, go into Kusinara and inform the authorities that our master has passed away, so they may begin the necessary arrangements." Venerable Ananda put on his outer robe and entered town. The Mala officials were holding a meeting to discuss local matters. When they learned the Buddha had passed away, they expressed deep sorrow and regret. They put aside all other work in order to make arrangements for the Buddha's funeral. By the time the sun was perched above the trees, everyone in Kusinara knew of the Buddha's death in the forest of sal trees. Many beat their chests and sobbed. They regretted they had not been able to look upon and bow to the Buddha before his death. People came to the forest bearing flowers, incense, musical instruments, and cloth streamers. They prostrated and placed flowers and incense round his body. They performed special songs and dances and draped colourful streamers throughout the forest. People brought food offerings to the 500 bhikkhus. Before long, the sal forest had the atmosphere of a festival. Occasionally, Venerable Anuruddha invited the sound of the large bell to call people back to silence. He then led everyone in reciting passages from the sutras. For 6 days and nights, the people of Kusinara and nearby Pava came to offer flowers, incense, dance and music. Mandarava blossoms and other flowers soon thickly carpeted the area between the two sal trees. On the 7th day, the Mala authorities bathed themselves in water perfumed with incense, put on ceremonial garments, and carried the Buddha's body into town. They passed through the town centre and out of the east gate to the Makuta Bahana temple, the main temple of the Malas. The town officials had planned a funeral fit for a king. The Buddha's body was wrapped in many layers of cloth and then placed in an iron coffin, which was placed in another larger iron coffin. It was then placed on a great funeral pyre of fragrant wood. The moment to light the pyre had come. Just as the authorities approached with their torches, a messenger on horseback rode up and asked them to wait. He informed them that Venerable Mahakassapa and 500 bhikkhus were on their way to the funeral from Pava. Venerable Mahakassapa had been teaching the Dharma in Kampa. He learned of the Buddha's imminent death in Vaisali and that the Buddha was travelling north. The Venerable immediately set out to find the Buddha. Everywhere he went, other bhikkhus asked to join him. By the time he reached Bahagama, there were 500 with him. When they reached Pava, they met a traveller coming from the opposite direction, with a sal flower tucked in his shirt. The man informed them that Buddha had already passed away in the sal forest near Kusinara 6 days earlier. With that news, Mahakassapa's search came to an end, and he led his bhikkhus towards Kusinara. They met a man on horseback who agreed to gallop ahead to inform the Venerable Anuruddha that they were on their way to attend the funeral. At noon, Venerable Mahakassapa and 500 bhikkhus reached the Makuta Bahana temple. The Venerable placed the end of his robe over his right shoulder, joined his palms, and solemnly walked round the altar 3 times. He faced the Buddha and prostrated along with the 500 bhikkhus. After they completed their 3rd bow, the pyre was lit. Everyone, bhikkhus and laity alike, knelt down and joined their palms. Venerable Anuruddha invited the bell to sound, and led everyone in reciting passages on impermanence, emptiness of self, non-attachment and liberation. It was a most majestic sound. When the fire died down, perfume was poured over the ashes. The coffin was lowered and opened up, and the authorities placed the Buddha's relics into a golden jar, which was placed on the temple's main altar. Senior disciples took turn guarding the relics. News of the Buddha's death had been sent several days earlier to other cities, and delegations from neighbouring kingdoms arrived to pay their respects. They were given a share of the Buddha's relics to be kept in stupas. There were representatives from Magda, Vaisali, Shakya, Kolya, Bulaya, Pava, and Vaitha. They divided the relics into 8 portions. The people of Magda would build a stupa at Rajgaha. The people of Licchavi would build one at Vaisali. The people of Shakya would build one at Kaplavatu. The Buli people at Alakappa. The Kolya people at Ramagama. The Vaita people at Vaitadeepa, and the Malas in both Kusinara and Pava. After the delegations returned to their own countries, all the bhikkhus returned to their own locales to preach and teach. Venerables Mahakasyapa, Anuruddha and Ananda brought the Buddha's begging bowl back to the bamboo forest. A month later, Mahakasyapa organized an assembly of bhikkhus at Rajgir with the purpose of compiling all the sutras and precepts that the Buddha had given them. 500 bhikkhus were selected based on their standing and experience in the Sangha. The assembly was to begin at the beginning of the retreat season and to last for 6 months. Venerable Kasyapa had been considered the 4th highest ranking disciple of the Buddha after Venerables Kondana, Sariputta and Moggallana. He was especially regarded for his simple living and humility. He had been deeply trusted and loved by the Buddha. Everyone in the Sangha had heard about the time 20 years earlier when Mahakasyapa had sewed his own Sangati from several hundred scraps of discarded cloth. Once he folded this Sangati and invited the Buddha to sit upon it. The Buddha remarked how soft a cushion it made, and Venerable Mahakasyapa offered the robe to the Buddha. The Buddha accepted it with a smile and offered his own Sangati to Mahakasyapa in return. Everyone knew that Mahakasyapa was the one monk who'd smiled the time the Buddha silently lifted up a lotus flower at Jetavana. Mahakasyapa had thus received the Buddha's transmission of the Dharma treasure. King Ajatasattu sponsored the assembly. Because Venerable Upali was highly regarded for his thorough knowledge of the precepts, he was invited to recite them all for the assembly, as well as recount the specific conditions and situations that gave rise to each of the precepts. Venerable Ananda was to be invited to repeat all the Buddha's Dharma talks, including the details concerning the time, place, and situation that gave rise to each talk. Naturally, Venerables Upali and Ananda could not be expected to remember every detail, so the presence of 500 respected bhikkhus was of great help. During the special gathering, all the precepts were compiled and given the name Vinaya Pitaka, the basket of discipline. The basket of compiled Dharma talks was named Sutra Pitaka. The sutras were divided into 4 categories based on their length and subject matter. Venerable Ananda shared with the assembly that the Buddha had told him that after the Buddha's death, they could discard the lesser precepts. The other bhikkhus asked Ananda whether the Buddha had clearly stated which precepts he meant, but Ananda admitted that he had not thought of asking the Buddha that question. After lengthy discussion, the bhikkhus decided to preserve all the precepts for both bhikkhus and bhikkhunis. Remembering the Buddha's words, they agreed not to render the sutras into the classical meter of the Vedic language. Admagadhi was the primary language the sutras and precepts were given in. The assembly agreed to encourage the translation of the sutras into other languages to enable people to study them in their native tongues. They also decided to increase the number of Bhanaka, bhikkhus whose role it was to recite the sutras in order to transmit them for both present and future generations. When the assembly adjourned, all the bhikkhus returned to their own places of practice and teaching. Along the banks of the Naranjana River, Venerable Savasti stood to watch the flowing waters. Young buffalo boys on the opposite shore were preparing to lead their buffaloes across the shallow river. Each boy carried a sickle and basket, just as Savasti had done 45 years earlier. He knew that the boys would fill their baskets with fresh kusa grass, while the buffaloes grazed. The Buddha had bathed in this same river. There was the Bodhi tree, more green and healthy than ever. Savasti slept beneath that beloved tree during the night. The forest was no longer the place of solitude it had once been. The Bodhi tree was now a place where pilgrims visited, and much of the forest had been cleared of brush and thorns. Venerable Savasti felt grateful that he had been one of the 500 bhikkhus invited to attend the assembly. He was now 56 years old. His closest friend on the path, Venerable Rahula, had died 5 years earlier. Rahula had been an embodiment of devoted and diligent effort. Though he was the son of royalty, he lived in utmost simplicity. He was a modest man, and though his accomplishments in spreading the teaching were great, he never spoke about them. Venerable Savasti had been with the Buddha on his last journey from Rajgaha to Kusinara. He was present during the final hours of the Buddha's life. On the road from Pava to Kusinara, Savasti remembered how Venerable Ananda asked the Buddha where he was heading. The Buddha simply said, "I'm heading north." Savasti felt he understood. Throughout his life, the Buddha had travelled without thinking about his destination. He had taken each step mindfully, enjoying the present moment. Like an elephant prince returning to its native land when it knows its time has come, the Buddha headed north in the last days of his life. He didn't need to reach Kapilavatthu or Lumbini before he passed into Nirvana. To head north was sufficient. Kusinara itself was the Lumbini Gardens. Drawn homeward in a similar way, Venerable Savasti had returned to the banks of the Naranjara the night before. This was his own home. He still felt like the 11-year-old who tended another man's buffaloes to feed his younger siblings. Uravela village was the same as ever. Papaya trees still grew before every house. The rice fields were still there. The gentle rivers flowed as before. Water buffaloes were still led and bathed by young buffalo boys. Though Sujata no longer lived in the village, and his own siblings had started families of their own and moved away, Uravela would always be Savasti's home. Savasti thought back to the first time he saw the young monk Siddhartha doing walking meditation in the forest. He thought of the many meals the village children had shared with Siddhartha beneath the cool shade of the pipala tree. These images of the past could live again. When the buffalo boys crossed over to his side, he would introduce himself. Every one of these boys was Savasti. Just as long ago he had been given a chance to enter the path of peace, joy, and liberation, he would show the path to these young boys. Venerable Savasti smiled. A month earlier at Kusinara, he'd listened to Venerable Mahakassapa tell about an encounter he'd had with a young bhikkhu named Subhadha, who'd travelled with him from Pava. When Subhadha learned that the Buddha had already passed away, he remarked glibly, "The old man is gone. From now on we're free. No one will scold or reproach us any more." Venerable Mahakassapa was shocked by the young bhikkhu's foolish comment, but he did not say anything. Venerable Mahakassapa did not scold young Subhadha, but he did not mince words with Venerable Ananda, even though Ananda was a deeply respected senior disciple. Venerable Ananda's presence at the assembly was considered essential in order to accurately compile all the sutras. Nonetheless, just 3 days prior to the assembly, Venerable Mahakasyapa had told Venerable Ananda that he was seriously considering barring Ananda from the gathering. The reason he gave was that although Venerable Ananda had a solid grasp of the teaching, he had not yet attained true realization. The other bhikkhus feared Ananda would be insulted by Mahakasyapa's comments and perhaps even leave. But Ananda simply retired to his own hut and closed the door. He remained there 3 days and nights deep in meditation. Just before dawn, on the day of the assembly, Venerable Ananda attained the Great Awakening. After practicing sitting meditation all night long, he finally decided to rest. As his back touched his sleeping mat, he attained enlightenment. That morning, when Venerable Mahakasyapa met Venerable Ananda, he looked into Ananda's eyes and knew at once what had happened. He told Ananda that he would see him at the assembly. Savasti looked up and saw the white clouds floating across the blue sky. The sun had risen high, and the green grass along the riverbank sparkled in the morning light. The Buddha had walked on this very path many times as he travelled to Varanasi, Savatthi, Rajgaha, and other places. The Buddha's footprints were everywhere, and with each mindful step, Savasti knew he was walking in the footsteps of the Buddha. The Buddha's path was at his feet. The same clouds the Buddha had seen were in the sky. Every serene step brought to life the old path and white clouds of the Buddha. The path of the Buddha was beneath his very feet. The Buddha had passed away, but Venerable Savasti could see his presence everywhere. Bodhi seeds had been planted throughout the Ganga basin. They had taken root and given rise to healthy trees. No one had heard of the Buddha or the Way of Awakening 45 years before. Now saffron-robed monks and nuns were a common sight. Many Dharma centres had been established. Kings and their families had taken refuge, as had scholars and officials. The poorest and most oppressed members of society had found refuge in the Way of Awakening. They had found liberation for their lives and spirits in this way. 45 years before, Savasti was a poor, untouchable buffalo boy. Today he was a bhikkhu who had transcended all the barriers of caste and prejudice. Venerable Savasti had been greeted respectfully by kings. Who was the Buddha that he'd been able to effect such profound change? Savasti asked himself that question as he watched the buffalo boys busily gathering kusa grass along the shore. Although many of the Buddha's senior disciples had passed away, there remained bhikkhus of great effort and attainment. Many of these monks were still young. The Buddha was like the seed of a mighty Bodhi tree. The seed had cracked open in order for strong roots to take hold in the earth. Perhaps when people looked at the tree, they no longer saw the tree, but the seed was there. It had not perished. It had become the tree itself. The Buddha taught that nothing passes from existence to non-existence. The Buddha had changed form, but he was still present. Anyone who looked deeply could see the Buddha within the Sangha. They could see him in the presence of young bhikkhus who were wise, diligent, and kind. Venerable Savasti understood that he had a responsibility to nurture the Dharma body of the Buddha. The Dharma body was the teaching and the community. As long as the Dharma and the Sangha remained strong, the Buddha would remain present. Venerable Savasti smiled as he watched the buffalo boys cross to his side of the river. If he didn't continue the Buddha's work by bringing equality, peace and joy to these children, who would? The Buddha had initiated the work. His disciples would have to continue it. The Bodhi seeds that the Buddha had sowed would continue to put forth roots throughout the world. Savasti felt as if the Buddha had sown 10,000 precious seeds in the earth of his own heart. Savasti would tend these seeds carefully to help them grow into strong, healthy Bodhi trees. People said that the Buddha had died, yet Savasti saw that the Buddha was more present than ever. He was present in Savasti's own mind and body. He was present everywhere. Savasti looked. In the Bodhi tree, the Naranjara river, the green grass, the white clouds and the leaves. The buffalo boys themselves were Buddha. Savasti felt a special relation to them. In a moment he would strike up a conversation with them. They too could continue the Buddha's work. Savasti understood that the way to continue the Buddha's work was to look at all things with awareness, to take peaceful steps, and to smile with compassion as the Buddha had done. The Buddha was the source. Venerable Savasti and the young buffalo boys were rivers that flowed from that source. Wherever the rivers flowed, the Buddha would be there.